Ladies and gents, let's get started. Kim Mahood is a writer and artist now based in Wamboyne, near Canberra.
Wamboyne. Sorry.
See, I'm not from Canberra. But Kim grew up in Central Australia, and on Tanami Downs Station she spends several months each year back here working on mapping projects with Aboriginal traditional owners and just recently writing workshops in town. Last week, a born and bred Centralian said to me, "Oh, I hear you're interviewing Kim Mahood." I remember them when they'd come into town, and kind of with a sense of awe she said they were real bushies. So this particular bushie grew up to become the author of two seminal Australian books, Craft for a Dry Lake, which I absolutely love, and Position Doubtful, which I'm about to start. And from among her many essays, we're here to discuss Country Needs People, Mapping and Minding Shared Lands. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kim Mahood. So I and we are certainly very glad to have you here, but I think we're lucky to get you. You're nicking out very shortly, is that right?
Yes, I've had 4 weeks in town. I'm heading out on Sunday, and it's actually a long time since I've spent an extended period. I used to more when there's a lot of people in the audience. Our mutual friend Pam Lofts was alive, and I used to stay with Pam. And I realised that probably for the last at least 10 years I've just come and gone and at most spent 4 or 5 days here. So it's been really, really interesting to have that extended time. And in fact, I've been staying just across the road from where we lived in Alice, over on the east side as well. And the now completely lush green park used to be like prickles and dust. And you could actually see the ranges from the house on Goyder Street. Now it's completely obscured by big gums and so on. So, yeah.
You've come at a good time. The weather's turning turning it on again
gorgeous.
For the last couple of weeks. You've been doing some writing workshops. Have you found us a new Booker Prize winner or something amongst the local writers?
Oh, maybe. Who knows? It's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
I'd really like to hop into it because the essay is big. They're big ideas. And it'll take us some getting through. It's all riveting stuff. So Country Needs People was published in August last year in the Monthly, and I believe there's a copy with Bronwyn if anyone wants to pick one up. It covers such a broad territory geographically and politically. It's a wonderful essay on so many levels. I really enjoyed it. But I wanted to start with the central place of the essay and kind of set the scene.
Sure.
Which was Martu country, WA in the Western Desert, perhaps previously best known for the community of Jigalong and its role in the rabbit-proof fence. But I've never been there. What's it like?
Look, as I say in the essay, a lot of Martu country is... I found a map made in the 1930s which marks out a section useless country, and that pretty much covers Martu terrain, and of course that's been their great advantage because they got to stay out in it. And they're among some of the last people to come in the 60s. So it's kind of the Percival Lakes run through the middle of it, so it's right in the middle of desert WA.
So fire and an Aboriginal relationship with the Australian environment is kind of central to the essay's argument, which I would say puts the case for burning country and kind of champions the role of Indigenous rangers in doing so. And yet you begin your discussion with a comment from the bottom of an online newspaper article, and they're always terribly incendiary, these comments. And here the commenter offers their thoughts on an Aboriginal relationship with environment. I'll just read it. It says, as hunter-gatherers, they ate a section of the country out, befouled it, and moved on to continue the cycle, for they knew no better, or to scratch an existence. Give a bush Aboriginal the choice of a house or an open shed, and he'll pick an open shed every time.
It's a cracker, isn't it?
So what's wrong with this picture, and why did you start there?
Look, actually, the very beginning of it, I think, I started it because in some ways it, when it gets into its stride, it's got almost biblical cadences to it, and for one of these things, it's quite well written, and also, I know heaps of these people.
Yeah, right.
They lit fires to burn out the animals for tucker mate and no other reason. Somehow or other, the goodies have explained that away as caring for the environment instead of permanently altering the environment. Yes, an actual fact, that's how these people lived as hunter-gatherers, for they ate a section of the country out, befouled it and moved on. That's that biblical stuff. I guess, you can overstate, I think, the amount of intention around the burning. I guess the point I make here is that when, Europeans arrived in Australia, it was a fire-constructed landscape. However, it happened in the first place, and probably a lot of it was a natural process. And over time, it got more and more refined. And so by the time, we got here, it was a landscape constructed around fire. So that's what we have inherited, is a fire-constructed landscape. The Madu are, I think, interesting because by the time I got to go and work with them, and mainly my work with them was based around paintings, they had actually been working with a couple of scientists for many years and discussing fire.
This is the birds.
This is the birds, yeah. Doug and Rebecca Bleachbird. And so they had actually, come up with the terms for the different sort of conditions, like from initial burning through to first grass, through to sort of that middle period where there's a lot of diversity, and then it starts to thicken up, and then it becomes the sort of old growth spinifex, and it's ready to burn again. So they were very, very sophisticated around having had those conversations. And I then, with the paintings, I had this mad job where I was working for I was doing some research for the exhibition We Don't Need a Map, and I just got given this sort of bunch of reproductions of paintings, list of artists, a map, and particularly this thing called the waterhole map, which had been created by getting all the Madu together, and they sang where all these waterholes they remembered were. So it was fairly accurate, but the other thing is all the names were on this waterhole map, and of course I kept finding the names in the paintings. So being as I work with maps, I started mapping the paintings onto this waterhole map. But in conversation with the artists, they were constantly mentioning fire. And a lot of the paintings were, they would sort of talk about, they'd done strips of sand dunes and they were painted in different colours, and they would say, that's because, we put fire through that bit but not that bit. And so they were very conscious about fire. I suspect a lot of that was to do with working with the birds, and also they had made a huge fire painting for the Canning Stock Route project.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess that's where, whether or not that level of sophisticated commentary existed before they were asked to do it, I don't know. But certainly with the Madu, that's really, what they do
because
now.
It's certainly taken off as an idea, hasn't it? There's sort of a divergence of opinions on it. There was a 2017 report that was supported by the Pew Charitable Trust, the American-based charitable trust. It reviewed the role of Indigenous rangers and said an expansion of mosaic burning could bring benefits to nature. In other words, if we want healthy ecosystems, the landscape must be burned now, still, to help nature, as it were. And that's kind of one side of the idea, or one side of the debate. But some Australians say, isn't it better to let nature take its course? How do we balance that?
Well, there's a lot of things that'd happen if we let nature just take its course, I guess. And how far back do we go when we talk about nature if Aboriginal people have been here for 60,000 years and they've been burning? In a sense, what they do is a part of that pattern. People do argue in that strand, that thread of responses that I was looking at, in some instances that, managed burning was interfering with nature, and the big, summer hot fires, that they were natural. But there's an indication, because with the Madu they were in their country till the 60s, they moved out of it, and then within 20 years in the homeland sort of program, they were back there. But that 20 years was long enough for it to be very evident from aerial photography and so on that while they were away, you got these very, very large burns started to happen again.
So how do they happen?
Are they
lightning strikes?
Lightning mostly.
Yeah, okay,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. Mm.
And so I'm kind of left with a couple of different ideas of nature, if you like, of one where we're integral and part of it and active in it, and another one where we're not, where it's some sort of immutable force on its own, that Mother Nature that we...
Oh, look, I'm very much somebody who says, you know, people are part of nature, and I think when I have an issue with the whole idea of, you know, wilderness being somewhere that people aren't allowed to go, except, of course, that handful of the elite who really know how to manage and deal with it, and, you know, the rest of us proles can't be trusted to kind of, you know, look after it or whatever.
You alluded to that in... there was an article, I think, the other day in the Centralian Advocate that sort of said this is you were suggesting this idea was problematic for some.
Did I? I forget. Probably. Yeah. I think it is. I mean, there's very, you know, people have very strong views about, you know, what is, you know, how to environmentally manage places.
Yeah.
But you know, we have heaps of evidence now of national parks that aren't managed, and they get full of ferals, and you know, they become a nightmare, and you know, it becomes a big problem. So.
Just go back to Madu for a second. In the 60s, between the 60s and the 80s, they were forced off their homelands, and so the landscape wasn't burned for that 20-ish year period. And hot wildfires swept through that area. And what happened? What's the difference?
Well, I guess what happens is that you lose that diversity, and so you just get great areas that. You know, I mean, over parts of the country it probably doesn't matter that much, really. But when you see areas that are just, you know, great strips of it where completely uncontrolled fire has gone through, compared to the mosaic, the biodiversity, it's got to be a better environment for wildlife and so on. If you've got sort of places they can hide. On the other hand, you know, all this sort of, there's been a fair bit of interest in discovering the night parrot. Yeah. And night parrot likes old growth spinifex. So, right. You know, if there isn't old growth spinifex, then there's nowhere for the night parrot. So,
but that burns hot.
But right. if there's limited, I mean, in an ideal mosaic system, you've got all the different patchwork. So there's always going to be some old growth spinifex somewhere.
Sure.
And there just seem to be areas that are less vulnerable than others too. So.
Okay, so I want to just spend a moment looking at your background in this, because you grew up not far from Madu country, really. In outback terms, it's kind of 2 doors over, I guess.
Look, growing up that's not quite what happened. I spent a chunk of my early life down at Fink, Apatula, on the edge of the Simpson Desert. Then my primary school years here. Right. So I was about 10 when my family sort of moved out to the Tanami. So, you know, a lot of this is actually the information I have, and I have to say, look, I am not an expert on this. I just pick stuff up. You know, I'm a bit of a jackdaw. I pick stuff up and put ideas together. I think what I did have though was always very much spent time with Aboriginal people. Felt that they had a relationship to the landscape that was you know, very profound and really interesting. I benefited a lot from it. I mean, as a kid down at Fink, I can remember walking along the sand dunes and being shown, you know, the route that actually had water in it and all those sorts of things. So I was predisposed to pay attention to all of that. At the same time, you know, I'm not sentimental or idealising it either. So.
What sort of brought you to writing? How early did you get involved in that?
I really didn't write until my first book Craft for a Dry Lake, which was published in 2000. I started writing it about 7 years before that. I wrote a lot, but it wasn't good enough for many years. And as a visual artist, I sort of, that took up, you know, that it's way more fun for a start, you know. And it's still way more fun. I still much prefer
It's hard work turning up to a desk every morning.
Well, it's so boring being inside your own head all the time, you know.
Yeah.
And also, of course, the first 7 or 8 drafts are just rubbish as well. You know, that's the worst of it. In fact, you know, talking about something like this can be quite daunting, because the process of writing an essay like this, which doesn't come naturally to me, you know, I don't normally work in this way. My process is to just gather heaps of material, you know, see what it kind of gives off, you know, find my ideas in the process of the writing, refine them, put them down, and then basically forget what I've said. So to actually sit here in front of an incredibly well-informed audience, most of whom actually know me, is probably one of the most daunting things I've done.
It sounds exactly like the process the rest of us are going through, so that's all fine. I actually love Craft for a Dry Lake, and if you don't mind, I just wanted to read a tiny snippet of it.
I'm not sure I remember anything about that.
To point to a question. So you had arrived back some years ago, I'm not sure when it was, and you stop the car and you get out and you write, "My pulse rate is up, everything takes on a hallucinatory clarity. I sit first, breathing deeply, then stretch full length, inhaling the smell of dried grass and earth, feeling the texture of grains of dirt on my bare arms. It is almost too much, this sense of belonging or coming home." We dearly love having you back. But can you elaborate on what it is that keeps bringing you back?
Look, this is an ongoing preoccupation of mine, which is that in some way, you know, and I think it's often the landscape of our childhoods, although people who come here seem to get co-opted as adults. But there's something about the way a landscape can sort of enter you sort of physically and psychically. And so I think we respond, you know, different landscapes make for different sorts of people in a way. But I have always felt that, you know, I think my very first memory is actually of, you know, drawing in red sand and having that sort of sense of a physical relationship to it. I think there's some kind of neurological thing that occurs, and I'll just go around in circles here now, so
that's
I
all
think
right.
it's too hard to answer that one.
What you're writing? The time that you've just spent here, 4 weeks, was that mostly writing time or
research
actually?
Time? Yeah.
Okay. And do you have family here, or is it friends and
friends? Yeah.
Okay.
No family here anymore.
All right. And so I'm thinking I might move forward from out of that now and fast forward to 2012, and you were working on the We Don't Need a Map exhibition. The first question I wanted to ask about that exhibit is, why was it called We Don't Need a Map?
Oh, the Māori themselves were just like, we are the map, we don't need maps. And, you know, the white fellas bring the maps out, but it's in us, we are the map.
It was quite a successful exhibition. Actually, it also became the title of that Warwick Thornton film.
Didn't it? Yeah, which I haven't seen, actually.
So reviewers called it neither purely art exhibition nor historical documentary. The Art Almanac called it mind opening. And on a kind of a humorous side, one critic said of the Araluan experience of an exhibition called We Don't Need a Map, that those unused to Aboriginal culture might have actually benefited from a map to navigate the exhibit.
Well, my contribution to it actually was a map too. It's a moving map.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. What can you tell us about your role in that?
Well, initially it was to go out and get more information about the paintings, because they had very, very generic, you know, the sort of stories that had been written down in the art centre were those totally generic. You know, this is about such and such a country, and you know, they walked here when they were young. That would be the end of it.
Sure.
And so I went out, as I say, with these paintings, and bit by bit started to realise, what a wealth of information was in them. But there were some really funny sorts of things too, where there was one that it was your classic sort of, sites with lines connecting them, and it had been, this rather baffled person who was documenting it had said, there's a suggestion that this may be this and this and this place. And then when I sat down with the painter, he said, oh no, that's a clay pan, that's the cracks on a clay pan. And so the scale was like... And then there was another one that had that same kind of, Nora Wampy, this is her country round Coonawarrigi, and this is such and such, and this is that location. That's a windmill, she said. I wouldn't paint a windmill. And you can see it, there it was, windmill. So there was some pretty entertaining things like that. And then I actually there was a piece about fire. They wanted to make something that was, rather than didactic, that was a sort of a sense of how Aboriginal people did work with fire. And the main thing I've seen when people are actually lighting fire, particularly young people, is it's like this dance, they're just like every pyromaniac's dream. You get to light up country, and that fearlessness. There's some great scenes in it that where it's already dark and there's just fire everywhere, and there's these figures of these teenage boys, and they're still lighting anything that's not lit, and they're in this kind of dance with the fire. And then there's these kids running along a windrow and just chucking matches in, So my sense was, let's create something that speaks about fire as this animate thing that people are in a relationship with.
Right.
And then there was another scene where there's an old fella speaking and a family sitting, and he's sort of saying in language, we used to light fires to communicate with each other and just say, here we are. But the great shot there is that the entire horizon is just on fire. It's like a holocaust. It's like, oh yeah, we're letting people know we're here, and you just, this great boiling black smoke. And they wouldn't let me put the bit in where there's an old fella and he's doing the, how to, because they can still make fire with the fire sticks and stuff, but it just was not going to work on that day. And so eventually the filmmaker gets the, lighter. And sets it off, and that's all been filmed, but they made me cut that out. Not authentic enough.
So how difficult was it to get sort of ground truth the information, if you like, to sort of check on everything and get the right... Because there's a lot of misinterpretation and assuming and stuff in this field, so...
Well, look, I think because that one was not setting out to be a kind of didactic,
right.
This is it, and I got to overlay... I mean, I had heaps of already fabulous film. A guy called Dave Wells does a lot of the filming for the Madu, so beautiful material. And I got to sort of overlay paintings that actually reflected the same things that were happening in the landscape. And, you always had somebody breathing down your neck saying, no, do that, fix that up, and so you would. And that wasn't an issue at all.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the paintings, because you say artists paint what they know, what they do, burning country, tracking reptiles, gathering plant food. And you go on to call them like an encyclopedia of seasons and burning practices. There's kind of implying this sort of body of knowledge in the paintings. Is that what you mean?
Well, certainly the painting that I'm referring to there, which was the one that ended up in... initially it was done... I can't remember. It's done as a collaboration with Lynette Walworth, and so you've got 8 women working on it, and it's about 5 by 3 metres. It's enormous.
Wow.
And they actually did it almost as a literal representation. And these are these same women who've been working with aerial, with satellite imagery, and they recognise what fire scars look like and so on. And they literally mapped out their area around Bangor over in Madu country, put the rivers in, oriented it, and then each took a section and painted, as theirs and painted it. and they simply painted all the types of vegetation and the landforms, and in a fairly literal way, something I haven't seen done that specifically before. And because when it came, it's in the Seven Sisters exhibition, and when I saw it, I said to Margot Neal, there's a lot more information in that painting than has been recorded. So they sort of sent me out there, and I sat down and, you know...
Ask more questions.
Yeah. And because I think, you know, a lot of it is, it's pretty straightforward, you know, the sense of... I mean, there's a lot of deep and esoteric material in some of the paintings, but some of them also, you know, there's this layer of quite literal information, certainly in...
A pragmatism, as it were.
You know, just a kind of representation of, you know, their place and what's in it. And
You, the satellite imagery interested me. You speak of a woman named Nola who worked directly onto... Can you tell us about how she works?
Well, there's a couple of them that use... They literally, you know... I mean, Nola's is probably the most literal of a, you know, painting fire scars with an aerial view, and, you know, taken almost directly from what she's seen of satellite imagery.
Yeah, right.
You know, so that's another one. She distorts it a lot more. You can actually see it in the painting, where it's, you know, it's almost like she uses the scars become flames in the way she paints. So it's, you know, taken to that next level.
Well, you would have loved that. It's speaking to that idea of this sort of thing that everyone's involved in. I'm an old geographer. I love maps. So possibly the thing that struck me most was the map on the doors. Which you referred to before, the waterhole map.
That's the waterhole map, yeah.
And I love that for so many reasons, but I wonder if you could just, in a little bit of detail, tell us about the emergence of that and what you then did to check on what had been represented on the painting.
Well,
the
map itself was made by Sue Davenport, or she facilitated it, and Peter Johnson early on, where they got these, I think it's three doors or something, and drew basically the Percival Lakes and waterhole locations that everybody knew about. But then all the old people gathered together, and that's when they started singing so that they could work out where the different locations were to each other. So, about 600 locations they came up with that they just sang and then placed them. You know, that's near that one. And of course there's lots of lines of waterholes.
Okay.
And what emerges when I started to look at it. And you know, they were by that stage being able to go out in helicopters and try and find and GPS these, and it was, you know, surprising how close to their actual location they were on this kind of conceptual or bodily remembered map that people had sung. But then when I started to take it a bit further, I overlaid it with an ordinary topo map, and then there's a program that will just show you elevations, and as soon as I used one of those, it became very clear that the waterholes all existed along old subterranean watercourses.
Right.
And so that underground flow all through that sort of central West Australian area was very easy to mark, and a lot of the Canning Stock route runs along it.
Yes.
The Percival Lakes, obviously, you know, they're very clearly a sort of petrified river, or, you know, salted up river. But all the underground stuff too is along these watercourses.
So it's not only the surface expression of which there isn't much of, but the underground system of flows of water as well.
And I think what triggered that for me was when we were going out and people were actually working on some paintings. They'd say we need to go to this site, and then they would sit down. There'd be a little bit of a kind of depression, and then they would paint these kind of spidery sort of flows, and I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Oh, that's the water flowing in. That's the underground water coming in."
Right.
And there were constant references to places where the water would come up out of the ground if you had a heavy rain. So people were very, very knowledgeable about what was happening, you know, underneath the ground.
Yeah.
Which makes sense when your life depends on it. But you know.
Well, I'm just wondering what it suggests for us. I mean, recently we've had this NT government decision to proceed with allowing fracking in the Northern Territory for gas exploration. And we do that without a great deal of knowledge of the natural systems that operate within the territory. We know a little bit, but there's not enough time, there's not enough money. And so is there another source of knowledge that we might be sort of marrying with our own to...
Look, I wouldn't know now whether people have still got that kind of knowledge in the territory. I mean, the Madu, as I say, they were, you might find it down in, somewhere in the pitlands maybe, where people have, that same dependence on knowledge of water, dryness, continual relationship to country. Whether there's anywhere in the territory that's still the case, I don't know. I mean, you would hope with the, going ahead with it, that there is a decent amount of knowledge about what's going on underneath.
You write about a particular painting that called Karl? Kulju, thank you, which you say was painted in response to fears the tailings from a uranium mine would pollute the underground water system.
That one...
Bring me into that.
I think what was interesting, and the Madu quite often do this, is that they will lay in the underground structure and then they'll paint over the top of it. So, because I think, and I'm kind of, I'm not certain, this is one of those ideas that's now hit me, is I have a feeling that quite a lot of the important songlines probably follow those as well. So when they're laying that in, they're laying in both the, where the water is, but also where those kind of cultural arteries are as well. And then they cover it up so that it's there but it's invisible. And then on top of that, they paint what comes to the surface. So, the different kinds of areas of vegetation and swamplands and whatever.
Sure.
So it's I love the, conceptually, I think it's
beautiful.
Fascinating that, it's there but it's concealed.
So I'm imagining that this, all of these things as part of this sort of body of knowledge that I think in the essay finds a kind of a focus through the Indigenous ranges that you talk about in the Indigenous ranges program, and I'm just wondering how that's through burning the landscape. But I'm wondering how that brings, how we might harness that, work together with that. What's your argument there?
Oh, look, I think the Ranger program is just, it's one of the kind of success stories. It's had, it has its glitches and hitches and so on. But I mean, again, the Madu, they were just made for it. They have about 7 ranger teams, 3 of which are women. But they also have, and fundamental to all of this now, I think, is good partnerships. I mean, there's too many other factors now to deal with. I mean, buffel grass. I mean, the old fire regimes are not going to handle that. How that happens is going to require a whole lot of, conversations with land management experts and whatever. You've got your ferals, you've got, massive changes caused. I mean, I do refer to what's going on up in Arnhem Land with the, the buffaloes. And so I think it's just this constant work in progress. It's different everywhere. You have places where there's still a lot of old knowledge. You have other places where there's very little. I mean, the Ranger program, they've got tiny little pockets over in, sort of where there's a little bit of country on coastal New South Wales. They might have a little IPA and a Ranger program. So I think its great value is its adaptability. And that it is, it is this collaboration, it's partnerships. And I guess the main thing there, and this comes through with, all the organisations that work well are based in usually really long-term partnerships of people, black and white, who work together and trust each other and are all doing the thing they do well, as opposed to being expected to do something that, they're not really good at. Decent funding helps it's amazing what people manage to do without very much.
Because it's not just you and the Madu and a handful of rangers. It's attracting big guns in terms of funding and so forth.
If you look at when Kaninipajugapa puts out their newsletter, on the back page, the number of people that support it, right, the sponsors and the different organisations are phenomenal. And, the team of, they attract and keep really good, white fellas, some of whom have worked there for years, many years. BHP bankrolls a lot of their projects, so they've got that relationship with the local sort of miners, and it's just across the board.
Sure.
And I think that's how you have to make these things work. So I did have an idea about the fracking. If it's going to happen, I figured it's going to unleash, shitloads of greenhouse gases. And now that they're working out this carbon credit scheme, what you do is all the companies that are going to do the fracking, they go into a partnership with working on country ranger groups, and it would actually underwrite it into the foreseeable future. So that's a model.
Well, let's see how that goes down. I'm just wondering if we might take a natural break there and go to some of the experts that we're both terrified are in the audience, and ask some questions. Jeremy, have you got a mic, or Fiona? Does anyone have any questions? Who wants to begin?
There's a mic coming back.
Because we're going to record this, we'll have to go to the trouble of sending a mic around to everyone.
I'm certainly not an expert, and that's why the question. You mentioned about how they sang their maps, that it was in them. Can you speak a little bit more about that process? I don't quite understand what...
Oh, I guess it's the, people have often areas of country, sites are embedded in sort of singing a mnemonic of, how they move from one place to the next. So that tends to kind of put them in, if there's a line of sites and people sing that. It's an incredibly complex idea, and I won't go into it in a big way because it's also the, their sort of ancestral stories are embedded in songs. So, all of things come together, but to sort of sit down and to remind each other what the songs are, and in that way to sort of, relocate where the sort of waterholes were in relation to each other.
It's very quiet. Have you got one, Fiona?
I was just going to say you must have intimidated everyone.
Must have. Yeah. I didn't think we were that bad. I'm just thinking, just before we came on, Peter, you had some thoughts, which I'm wondering whether you want to offer.
Just to elaborate on your side of it, I had the gentleman who's now the chairman of the Northern Land Council visiting me with, he was a ranger with us at that stage, with a colleague of his from Top End, and a white fella who was looking after them. And we were talking about this kind of thing, like you said, about buffalo grass changing things and so on. And the white fella kept saying, but you Aborigines know everything. And eventually, what's his name now, the chairman of the Northern Land Council? Joe Morrison, got up to the white fellow and said, listen, mate, stop putting us on a pedestal. We can work together. Because, you white fellows have got one side of the story, we've got the other side, and the combination is what makes things happen.
And I think that was the beautiful thing that came out through your essay for me, was the idea of this marriage of two systems of knowledge that could actually attend to some of the issues that we're facing, which are enormous.
And I mean, another point in the essay which we haven't really got to, which I flag, is the mismatch actually between what a lot of Aboriginal people consider caring, what they call caring for country, and what environmentalists also consider. I mean, I write about a situation where the Nature Conservancy, purchased a property, but the traditional owners still had visiting and hunting rights to it, and the caretakers, used to be, they were really, really hated the TOs coming because, I think one of them was they weren't actually Australian either. They were very, deeply sort of conservationist minded, and, this bunch of blackfellas would turn up and kill things and eat them and set fire to stuff and so on. And they were really, they hated them turning up.
How was that resolved, if at all?
I don't know. It's ongoing, It's a
Still arguing.
Yeah, that's right. They I think they just, sit stewing and brewing. And you often encounter, you hear stories about somebody who has their first sort of trip out with Aboriginal people, on country. And, of course, a big goanna races across the road and someone leaps out and clubs it. And the poor starry-eyed visitor, just about has a heart attack. So...
I was thinking when you were talking before about another one of those newspaper article comments that you drew on that suggests that the Indigenous rangers should get a real job, and I wondered if you might just elaborate for us on because they do lots of great stuff, and I'd be interested to know more about that.
Yeah, look, I think it's been interesting because it's been around. It's about 20 years now. I think the first 10 years it was a kind of CDP funded, kind of hit and miss. But the fact that it did just take off and kept on growing, eventually it was given proper funding and the working on country, and at the same time they brought in a whole lot of requirements and. People were taught skills and so on. And there was a period where that, for some people, the old, much more flexible model, it worked better in some circumstances. And I can remember myself thinking at the time, I don't know, once you start imposing these tighter constraints and so on, you're going to lose a lot of people. And in some instances that happened. But I think in the long term now, what it's done, it has made it a proper job. And so you do have... people that are, really committed to it. And I think initially they probably did have it a bit too structured, and they've made it flexible again. So you have your sort of your full-time guys, and then you've got, casuals and part-timers. And so, when you've got a big job, you can call on more people, and then it might sort of shrink back to a core of half a dozen or whatever. But, now it's Australia-wide. They have big get-togethers. There's all that sort of energy generated by groups kind of competing with each other and things like that. So I think it's sort of taking the place of the old days of the stockman. It's the only thing that is developing the same level of status. It hasn't got there yet. I don't know if it'll ever quite take
traction.
And traction.
Yeah.
It's got the traction, that's right. And of course the other thing, in ideal situations, if you have a community where you've still got elders with knowledge, you've got a ranger group, you're in a remote community where there's very, very few jobs, to have a junior ranger group and to absolutely incorporate it into the school system. So the kids go out, they learn to use, technology, but they also get the training. You go out with a bunch of elders and they identify plants, they learn the medicinal uses and whatever. They sort of where language is maybe an issue, they learn the language names. So it's just a perfectly integrated thing. So when a couple of years ago there was a suggestion it was going to be downgraded back to CDP and whatever, I think a lot of us went. I mean, that was one of the triggers for me to. I was invited by the Monthly to write. It was more or less have you got something you would like to write about? I had my 15 minutes of kind of, after Position Doubtful was published, that I actually got to choose. And so I said I would like to write about, Indigenous ecological knowledge. And one of the strands I was really going to push was, how could you even imagine downgrading the only, really good sort of coming particularly out of the sort of remoter regions, the only thing that's actually worked. Yeah. It wouldn't be the first time, of course, that something has been kicked in the arse because it works, but but I think a whole lot of us, there was a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes as well that's died a natural death, and it's now getting support from all sorts of different, sources.
Oh, fantastic! Yes, Margaret.
Kim, I can't remember. I know I read your article, and I can't remember the details, but I know I appreciated it greatly. But I'm wondering how much of this has come from grassroots up, and how much of it's actually been driven by politics and policy. Has the policy run to keep up with what's happening from the grassroots, or have there been policy initiatives that actually help from the start?
Look, I actually don't know the answer to that. Policy is not something that I've ever managed to get my head around. I think it's probably a bit of both. The program began out of it actually started up with the Jelk Ranges to manage a feral pig problem. And so that was CDP funded. And then, of course, there were all sorts of other things, and there was this, group of, I think they were all young men at that stage, and it just expanded from there. So it was very ad hoc to begin with, but I think as it started to really gain some traction, then, some policy was brought in. Obviously, the decision to create the Working on Country program has to have been a policy decision, but how it's evolved from there, I'm not really sure. So, but I'd suspect that there's been some. What I notice constantly is that what's happening out on the ground is usually way ahead of what the politicians have got their head around. Just being back in Alice for a month and. You have the conversations continually about things that are happening. Most, even really interested and well-intentioned people down, I live near Canberra, it doesn't cross their radar. And you can see some of the decisions the politicians make and some of the things they say, that they're way behind the eight ball as far as understanding what is happening and how dynamic and how interesting the sort of, I think there's an energy happening, and I think those partnerships is like there's been at least a generation of long, deep, fruitful partnerships. Organisations here like NPY Women's Council is a fantastic example of it, and people are beginning to come to understandings and develop things that I just don't think that most of the politicians have got the faintest notion of, which is another reason to try and write this stuff into that realm. Someone just behind.
We've got another question. Yeah.
Question. Is that all right?
They're kicking in there.
Hi, my name's Catalina. I worked about the time you wrote that book, and one of my dear friends brought it to me. I was working on pitlands for German homelands, 9 homelands. And at that time we had a very good, very robust CDP program. Mm-hmm. I was managing that with my chairman, but also helping to develop the homelands. And that was 9 homelands, big projects. And quite often during that time, if I talked outside to people and they say, well, what do they work at, meaning the local people, and why don't they get real jobs? And I'd say, well, do you want them to go to Melbourne to factories or something like that? No, they live there. This is their country. It's Pitjantjatjara lands. Now, what's happened to 9 homelands, and I still see some of the people, although I've not been involved in the work, most of them are gone, except the ones that are closest to Amata. And some of the people, the traditional owners, they still live around there, but they're too old to actually keep developing them. But I don't know if you know, and I want to follow up, because we lost, and I say we because we're so involved in it, most of those homelands, and they were beautiful, and they were more or less almost functioning again at the time. And I just wonder if you know or heard if there's any revival. No?
No idea, sorry.
There's often on Facebook something about let's save the homelands, and I sign petitions.
No, I don't know. Sorry, I haven't got any inside knowledge about that one.
Okay, thank you.
Just before we start to draw this to a close, I'd be keen to know if anyone's involved with ranger groups here, or involved. I'm thinking particularly of you, Jimmy, and I know you're ducking for cover there, but you don't have to answer. But I'm just thinking there's probably other people who are involved in ranger groups as well, or exposed to that, and could talk to us about how their particular thing is going. Thank you, Jimmy.
Thanks, Glenn, for dubbing me in.
Just what you wanted.
And thanks, Kim, as well. I think we were both in Canberra at the same time for the launch of the 10 Deserts project, which is a very exciting project that has sort of come from the grassroots, from different collaborations, where now there's 8 different groups from covering a vast area of the country, from the Mardoo up in the Western Australia and southern Kimberley, all the way down to the Simpson Desert and all the desert country in between, working together on buffel grass in the Great Victoria Desert, working on keeping culture strong, training and building capability of rangers, and working across the board for fire, regional processes, cross-border collaboration. And it's funded by the BHP Billiton Foundation, which is a US foundation that is funding environmental projects across the globe. And this one has taken their interest. And I think I was going to actually comment on this as well, just in terms of, it's interesting that we've got Pew, an American foundation, we've got the Nature Conservancy, a US foundation, the BHP Billiton Foundation, a US foundation, that are all putting quite significant sums of money into land management across the outback, as they're calling it. And how, at the same time, we've got a federal government who is looking to... There was a comment I remember seeing on Facebook that the current approach to the donations and foreign donations that the government was pursuing could see Aboriginal rangers actually being described as foreign agents, because they are actually working...
I remember that.
Working for getting paid through Pew or the Nature the Nature Conservancy. So it's really interesting that it is US foundations who are backing a lot of this work, and that we're not necessarily seeing the philanthropic Australia coming in on board in this space. So whether that's just got to do with scale or not, I'm not too sure. But there are some really exciting things. So check out, I'll give it a plug, 10deserts.org. There's a really exciting project, probably the most exciting thing happening in Indigenous and conservation and land management across Australia at the moment.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Yeah, no, that's I was there, and it is pretty exciting. So yeah.
I'm just we're about at time, so I might just ask one last question, which is, can we know what's on the horizon for you, writing wise, or?
Well, the thing I've been researching while I'm here mainly is the Udikulinjaku project, which the NPY Women's Council are running, which I think is astonishing. And it's interesting, I've never done this sort of research before. As I said, even with this, I'm not naturally a journalist. I tend to be, I just gather stuff in, I get an idea. I mean, the essay Kartiya Like Toyota's just evolved out of years of, being in that environment and making notes and ultimately thinking this, this has to be out there. So to actively take something on...
Can you briefly describe what that project for the NPY is?
It's looking at... it's dealing with sort of mental health issues, but it began with a group of women from, NPY, APY, Nganajara, and working with mental health professionals to find language to name at a very complex level the sorts of experiences people were having, the sort of mental states caused by various sorts of trauma, you know, and I think there's probably nowhere else something like that could happen at that level, because that group are unique in their sort of still strong connection to country, very deep cultural knowledge, and then working at this very high level of conversation about, you know, cognition and impact on the brain of trauma, this sort of thing. It's astonishing.
Wow.
So that's an immediate project which I'm doing for the monthly. But otherwise, I think the next thing is going to be fiction, because I've got all the stuff I've had to leave out of the non-fiction that needs to, that sort of big picture stuff that you just can't.
All the good bits.
All the good bits, yeah. And it's such a fundamentally complex, and I've always been much more interested in the things that break stereotypes, and how ordinary people across the board behave towards each other. And, all these, we've been talking in that sort of more abstract way about these programs and their significance, and they're incredibly important. But, I've watched a fantastic program or something potentially fabulous that has been, sabotaged through, human jealousy, and we know we deal with this sort of stuff all the time, the internal things that go on, and I suppose there's a level at which I actually find that more interesting than policy, which is why I'm not, working in the sorts of jobs that lots of people out there are who are doing proper jobs, as opposed to I just watch and observe and note and,
Thank God
write
you
it down.
I introduced myself to Kim in 2012, and we've only seen each other about 3 or 4 times since. And every time we sort of pass each other by, we say, "Oh, we must sit down and have a chat." And this is that chat.
Done it.
So please, I've really enjoyed myself. Please put your hands together for Kim Mahood.